was 1928, the year penicillin was discovered, Mickey Mouse hit the big screen, and Charles Lindbergh received the Congressional Medal of Honor for completing a solo, non-stop flight from New York to Paris. In doing so, Lindbergh claimed the $25,000 Orteig Prize and beat out dozens of other aviators who had set their sights on making the crossing. One of these pilots was a young German by the name of Franz Romer. It's unclear if Romer was unable to gather enough sponsors to back his flight, or if the clock simply ran out. But we do know that following the Lindbergh flight, he was approached by the kayak manufacturer Johannes Klepper. Klepper suggested to Romer that he instead make the Atlantic crossing by water in one of his sea kayaks. Flying wasn't the only skill that Franz had picked up during his 29 years of life. As a boy growing up near Lake Constance in Bavaria, he learned to sail, and after serving in the First World War, he would go on to become a merchant seaman and licensed navigator. Not content to fade into the background noise of history, Romer agreed to Klepper's offer, on the sole condition that he be allowed to design the vessel. The fault boots, or folding kayaks, that Johannes Klepper produced at his factory in Rosenheim, Bavaria, were direct descendants of the animal skin kayaks that had been in use by Arctic peoples for thousands of years. The design that Romer eventually settled on was a 21.5-foot frame, sheathed in a rubber hull and a canvas deck. The two Bavarians settled on the name Deutscher Sport for the boat, which translates as German sport. And no doubt a sporty ride it would be. At 39 inches wide and a mere 18 inches deep, the kayak sat only 6 inches above the waterline when fully loaded with provisions. An 8-foot wooden mast, rigged with a square sail, would be the main source of propulsion for the voyage. Romer's intended route would take him from Lisbon, Portugal, down to the Canary Islands off of the coast of North Africa. From here he would join with the northeast trade wind, a conveyor belt of air circling the globe, that would carry him across the open Atlantic to the Antilles. From here he planned to continue sailing north along the coast of North America, up to New York City. If successful, he would claim a $25,000 prize that a businessman had promised him. It's unclear what connection, if any, this prize had with the one awarded to Charles Lindbergh by the hotelier Raymond Orteig. Romer would have no radio and no support team to call on even if he did. He would carry all of his own supplies and would need to be prepared to spend months alone at sea as he sailed westward. His route, the very same that European sailors had used to reach the Americas since the time of Columbus, would carry him along the notoriously dangerous Atlantic hurricane corridor. He would need every ounce of resolve he could muster, and a great deal of luck to survive the journey ahead. On the 31st of March, 1928, after months of careful preparation, Captain Franz Romer kissed his wife farewell in Lisbon and sailed off into the Atlantic Ocean. He would never see her again. On April 9, 1928, on the opposite side of the ocean, a township in South Florida was officially incorporated. Now home to more than 500 people, the town of Belgrade's first settlers were employees of Hamilton Distance Dredging Company. The workers had been tasked with the excavation of the nearby Hillsborough Canal as part of a larger project to connect Florida's waterways. In 1881, Diston had acquired an astounding 4 million acres of Florida's land at a price of 25 cents per acre, in one of the most lopsided land purchases in U.S. history. The young entrepreneur saw promise in his investment and immediately set out to create a navigable waterway through the heart of the state. To realize his vision, he leveraged the full weight of industrial technology of his era. Dredges cut canals, connected lakes together in a chain. Men blasted cliffs with dynamite, deepened creeks, and straightened parts of the Kissimmee River to allow barges to pass. By the mid-1880s, Diston had accomplished his goal of constructing a continuous waterway from central Florida down to Lake Okeechobee and out west to the Gulf of Mexico. For the first time in history, boats could carry people, livestock, and winter crops from Kissimmee to Fort Myers and on to the rest of the world. As the wetlands began to dry, farming communities started to spring up in the area surrounding Lake Okeechobee, particularly on the southeast side where the soil was discovered to be especially rich. Farmers planted fields of sugarcane, beans, and the many types of vegetables which could be grown year-round in the area's subtropical climate. Belgrade was just one of 16 farming settlements that collectively became known as Florida's Muck Bowl. Depending on how you phrase the question, Lake Okeechobee is either the second or third largest freshwater lake contained entirely within the United States. At over 720 square miles, the large circular lake is readily visible from space. From its center, the nearest shore is at least 15 miles away in any given direction. Despite its size, the lake is actually surprisingly shallow, with an average depth of only 9 feet. Okeechobee is not only one of the biggest lakes in North America, it forms the headwaters of the largest mangrove ecosystem in the Northern Hemisphere, the Everglades. Not long after completing the project for which history would remember him, Diston boasted to the newspaper that his canals had lowered Lake Okeechobee's water level by 1.5 feet, effectively removing the threat of flooding to nearby communities. But in reality, Florida was in the midst of a dry cycle, and only a few short months after officially becoming a town, the people of Belle Glade would learn firsthand how mistaken Hamilton Diston had been. In preparation for a voyage of 3 months, Romer had packed 600 tins of food, loads of lemons, and 75 gallons of water into the hull of the Deutscher Sport. To be able to stretch out from a seated position, he would either have to stand up or eat through his supplies to create room. The first leg of his journey would take him more than 800 miles southwest from Lisbon to the Canary Islands. He slept upright in a seated position under a homemade rubber sheet designed to keep the salt water from splashing onto his face. A tube extended from a small hole in the fabric so that he could breathe. He was only ever allowed to rest a few minutes at a time. Early on in the trip, he encountered a storm. His leg muscles began to atrophy, and he developed boils on his thighs and buttocks. Romer persevered, however, finally reaching the port of Las Palmas on the island of Gran Canaria. Gran Canaria lies 140 miles off the coast of North Africa. The original inhabitants of the islands were a tribal people known as the Guanche, who were colonized by Spain beginning in 1483. Less than a decade later, Christopher Columbus would sail from the port of Las Palmas and kickstart the conquest of a new group of islands, the West Indies. Because of its strategic location between Europe, Africa, and the northeast trade winds, the port of Las Palmas would go on to play a central role in the colonization of the Americas for several centuries. In the age of sail, ships moved at the mercy of the elements, and the trade winds acted like a giant conveyor belt, shuttling people and goods from the old world to the new. It was this very same route westward that Romer intended to follow. He arrived to Gran Canaria in poor condition and spent more time recuperating than anticipated. The window to launch before hurricane season was rapidly closing. Finally, on June 10th, the captain departed Las Palmas and headed for the open ocean. The apprehension he would have felt as the Canary Islands disappeared behind him must have been something like what Columbus's crew felt as they sailed into the uncharted expanses of the Atlantic Ocean. But unlike those sailors, Romer wasn't sailing aboard a Spanish caravel or a Portuguese nau, designed to withstand the rigors of long-distance ocean travel, but a rubberized sea kayak. For navigation, he carried only a compass, sextant, binoculars, and a barometer. At night, he used the stars for orientation. Only able to doze off for a few moments at a time, he existed in a state of perpetual exhaustion. A guideline running from the boom to the rudder helped to keep the Deutscher Sport true to course as he made the long, long journey west. He wouldn't have had the option to stop sailing at any point, especially in rough conditions, or his kayak could capsize. He would need his momentum to ride out the waves. For 5 sleepless days and nights, he battled for survival during the worst storm of the trip. When the sky eventually cleared, he was battered, but still alive, and still afloat. He was later quoted as telling someone of the blood-curdling and heart-breaking moments he experienced during the storm. On a couple of occasions, sharks took an interest in the sailor and his curious little boat. According to the September 13, 1928 New York Times article titled, "Canoe Adventurer Talked to Sharks," sun and spray tortured Captain Romer's hands and arms, and they were swollen, blistered, and stiff. He lost his hat in a wind. Then his head, neck, and back got more of the sun. 3 sharks took a fancy to his curious craft. They played about the canoe, swimming from side to side, at times darting under the boat and coming so close that he could feel the scrape of the fins through the flexible rubber bottom. Captain Romer, lonely, talked to the sharks, but they swam away. Franz continued on, riding the narrow margin between sleep and waking, between life and death. On the 31st of July, after turning down the assistance of several passing ships that mistook him for a wreck survivor, the captain arrived at St. Thomas in the U.S. Virgin Islands. He had been 58 days at sea. On August 2nd, the harbor master discovered a man anchored in St. Thomas, seated upright and unconscious. His face was burned red and caked in salt. He was unable to walk, but still very much alive. It was Franz Romer. The harbor master towed him and his Deutscher Sport into the wharf. The German captain's arrival was met initially with little fanfare, but as news of his voyage spread quickly across the small island, excitement mounted. After allowing the captain to make a full recovery, Governor Waldo A. Evans declared August 22nd a public holiday in his honor, and a parade was held. At 3 p.m., the parade started from the Chamber of Commerce headquarters, headed by German and American banners. Many hearts throbbed with pleasure when the flags flew of these two nations, which were a few years ago spilling each other's blood on the battlefields of Europe, were unfurled in the atmosphere of affection. The United States Naval Band, under Bandmaster Adams, sounded forth the favorite German melody, Old Comrades, and a crowd numbering several thousands followed behind the officers of the Chamber of Commerce, in whose midst was seated the valorous navigator, Captain Romer. When the procession reached Market Square, a great ovation was given Captain Romer. Soon he was paid homage for his courageous deeds by the citizens of St. Thomas. He was given a gold medal, specially made for the occasion, which the governor pinned on his breast. Even though the worst appeared to be behind him, Romer's journey wasn't over just yet. He still had to make it to New York to claim the prize money, and the heart of hurricane season was fast approaching. When he chose his departure day, the harbor master considered the conditions unsafe and declined to sign his clearance papers. Undaunted, the captain crept down to his vessel under the cover of night and made the 100-plus-mile crossing to Puerto Rico. Some of the departing words for Captain Romer as he left the Virgin Islands were printed in the August 25th St. Thomas mail notes. It is our sincere hope that the same providence that brought you here will guide you safely to your destination and preserve your life for the good of your fatherland and humanity in general. We wish the brave captain Godspeed. Upon his arrival in San Juan, he was greeted by an exuberant crowd. But out in the Atlantic, a storm had already begun to form off the coast of West Africa. It was September now, and the same winds that had carried Romer across the ocean now steered a tropical depression westward. As the storm crossed vast expanses of warm water, it gathered strength, growing into a hurricane. The word hurricane itself comes from the language of the original inhabitants of Puerto Rico and the surrounding islands, a group of cultures known collectively as the Taíno. Huracán meant storm god in their language, and is just one of the many Taíno words still in use today. Words like barbecue, hammock, iguana, tobacco, potato, and canoe. The Spaniards learned much from the Taíno in a short period, and in return the islanders were the first to learn of Spanish cruelty. In less than 50 years, a culture that previously inhabited the region for centuries had all but vanished. On September 11th, after fitting a small outboard motor to his kayak, Romer left San Juan bound for Hispaniola. He missed the hurricane warning by an hour. 2 days later, the storm made landfall in Puerto Rico as a Category 5 hurricane, devastating the island. Out on the open ocean, Romer had no way to escape the maelstrom. As he was approaching the northeastern tip of Hispaniola, the Deutscher Sport was overtaken by sustained 160-mile-an-hour winds. No trace of Captain Romer was ever found. Most of the details of his voyage were lost, along with his journals into the Puerto Rico Trench, the deepest point of the Atlantic Ocean. Three days later, on September 16th, 13-year-old Helen McCormick and her family gathered in her stepfather's house near Belle Glade. They were 19 members in total. The matriarch of the family, Helen's mother, did not want to leave the house and decided they would be safer there than running away in the car. At about 8:30 that night, the hurricane's eye passed directly over Belle Glade and crossed Lake Okeechobee's southeast corner as a Category 4 storm. A half an hour later, the 5-foot mud dike, built to protect crops from summer rains, gave way and sent a wall of water rushing into town. The McCormick house quickly began to fill. Someone cut a hole in the ceiling so that they could get onto the roof. The piano was moved beneath it and they climbed to escape the rising water. Knocked off its foundation, the house was moving with the raging flood. Helen clung tightly as it twisted and turned. Chunks of the dike as big as houses knocked down anything in their path. Buildings crumbled, sending timber flying through the air. I was holding onto the roof and calling out to my mother, first me, then my brother. I'd say, "Mama, are you there?" And she'd answer, until after a while she didn't answer anymore. The house turned upside down, and Helen went underwater. When she emerged, miraculously she was unhurt. "I remember the rain. I thought it would beat me to death," she later said. When the winds let up and the waters began to recede, Helen and her stepfather were the only ones who remained. 17 of her relatives lost their lives, including her mother and baby brother. The town of Belle Glade, where floodwaters rose to 8 feet just an hour after the dike collapsed, was nearly wiped off the map. Many of the bodies were buried in mass graves or burned with diesel fuel to prevent the spread of infectious disease. Many more were washed away in the floodwaters into the tangled roots of the Everglades, never to be found. In the aftermath of the storm, Helen's stepfather gathered up what little was left of their house and gave it to one of his farmhands so that he could rebuild. Helen was sent off to live with her grandmother in another part of the state. I walked away from it that morning, she said, and never saw any of it again. The 1928 Okeechobee hurricane, as it would become known, was the deadliest in Florida's history. 1,600 died in the floods that night, most of the casualties occurring in the hour following the breach of the dike. Many were migrant farm workers who had been living in shacks. From the island of Guadeloupe, where it first made landfall, to the Florida peninsula, the storm claimed the lives of at least 4,000 people in total, and left many more in a state of desperation. In Puerto Rico, where it was called the San Felipe II hurricane, 500,000 people were left homeless. To this day, it remains the only recorded cyclone to make landfall on the island at a Category 5 intensity. The lesson of 1928 is more relevant today than at any point in the past century. Despite our most heroic and sometimes delusional efforts, at the end of the day we exist at the mercy of nature. The northeast trade winds' impact on the history of the Americas cannot be overstated. These same winds have delivered ocean travelers, storm gods, explorers, and conquerors to American shores, and what they will bring with them in the future remains equally uncertain. The world ocean is warming at an alarming rate. Global temperature increases have caused vast swathes of coral reefs across the planet to bleach and die within just a few years. As the planet continues to warm and sea levels rise, hurricanes are predicted to increase in the scale of their destructive power. To date, 2020 was the most active hurricane season since record keeping began, during which 30 named tropical cyclones formed over the Atlantic basin.